All
Hello,
right.
puppies and kittens. I am speaking with Afrophysicist 314, who said just to call him Afro, and I don't feel comfortable with that. But you wanted to you wanted to explain some things about your background, your experiences, what have you. I'm happy to hear it. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, first, I just wanted to say it's nice to meet you, Arn. I've been watching your channel for quite a few years now. I don't recall when I actually found it, but I was already an atheist by the time I found your channel. Oh, look at the kitty. That's actually something that I like about your channel, actually. All of the, like when you show off your animals and stuff, I think it's pretty cool.
Well,
Um,
thank
yeah. So, yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about me, um, who I am, where I come from, and then just dive into my deconversion story, which I think at this point now, so I'm 30 years old now. Um, I think I've been an atheist for about 10 years now. Um,
I'm
I
embarrassed. I was 30 years old longer ago than you've been alive. I was 30 years ago before you were
Wow.
born.
Yeah, so it's like um I don't know. I find the story interesting, and I just thought it would be nice to share it with people, and maybe um, it does resonate with someone who watches, because I think sometimes so you can tell by the name. So I am black. I'm a black American. I do think sometimes people from my community, uh, you know, may have issues with coming out with being an atheist. Now, I didn't really have any issues with that because of the religious community I was around personally. I didn't really have a lot of issues with, but you don't find a lot of black atheists, and I think most of them are probably quiet, because I do think that there are, uh, depending on where you live. For me, this wasn't the case, but there could be some serious repercussions community wise.
As an
Yeah.
obvious outsider, I'm always been curious about that. It seems to me that Christianity was obviously forced upon the slaves that were brought over,
Hmm.
uh, vehemently forced, and that it's strange to me that you end up with a culture that didn't just blend Christianity into their existing cultures, but they just like just adopted or embraced Christianity wholeheartedly, knowing where it came from.
Hmm.
Now, I've only spoken to a few. Yeah, as you said, there's not many atheist activists in the African American community, whatever. But the few that I've spoken to have lamented this very thing.
It's very, it's definitely ingrained in the culture. I think, which I'll talk about in a second once I get into my story. But I've noticed too that a lot of the people, and this is kind of true in general, I think for the wider American society, uh, but it can be, I think, a little bit stronger in the black community where people of faith, these are people who are usually just for some reason very highly respected in the community, and a lot of times people don't question them at all. You know, if you live in an environment where, I don't know, maybe people think that you need some sort of male role models and they claim that there aren't any around, some of the first people that they go to are pastors. This is, we want you to spend time with this guy, you know. So I don't know. And I think, with the civil rights movement and stuff, and Dr. King is like heavily pushed, and it wasn't until I got older and realized that there were actually a lot of secular people who were a part of that movement, and we don't really hear about those people. We just, everybody likes to put Dr. King on this pedestal, like everyone. Conservatives do it too. They don't want to talk about the secular sect, I guess, of that whole like civil rights movement. They played a big part in all of that.
Conversely, I somehow never thought of King's movement as being sectarian. I always thought of it as a secular movement.
Interesting.
Different background.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we'll get into all this. So a little bit about me. So born and raised in the Midwest. I family situation's a little complicated. So what I do find interesting though about my story is that I'm actually my parents were actually from a much older generation than uh, my peers' parents. So um, my father, so I was born in 1994. My father was actually born in 1936 in Mississippi. My mother was born, I believe, in 1958 in Tennessee.
Your
Uh,
your father.
yes.
Okay. Now you are the same age as my son,
Okay.
and your father is younger than my mother, and I'm old enough to be your father. So
Yeah.
that confuses me.
Yeah. So my understanding is this. So both of them have passed away. Uh, my father and my mother met at a very interesting time. So I found out a bit more about my family history, like maybe a couple of years ago. Um, so my mother, so they eventually moved from Tennessee to Missouri after her mother died. So my grandmother. Um, and her father just wasn't good to her and her brother, and they got involved with uh, drugs very like early. Like I'm talking like 12, 13 years old apparently. And she had been using drugs basically since she was an early teen for most of her life. And it's what indirectly caused to her death a couple of years ago. So then she eventually moved to the state that I'm from. Somehow, so my understanding is this: my father was originally a decent guy. So he was actually married for several decades to one woman, and they had a bunch of kids, and he raised his kids and everything. But then for some reason in the 1980s, he gets involved with some not so great people. He gets involved in the drug trade, crack cocaine specifically, and he started experimenting with it and he got addicted. And my mother, who had already been doing drugs, somehow they met and they decided they wanted kids, more kids, I guess. So in 1994, I was born, and I was actually taken away from my parents before I was even 1 years old. My understanding is I was about like 8 or 9 months. There was some incident that occurred where I got burned by some drug paraphernalia or something like that. And they decide again, hey, we're going to have another kid. And then they have my sister. And she was taken away from them immediately. So I ended up in foster care, and I did get to meet, I knew who my mom was and stuff, and I did meet my dad a few times. Um, but it's interesting because the woman who was my foster mom was also older, and she eventually adopted me and my sister, and that's the family that I was raised in. And this is a black woman who I think she just turned about like 86 or 87. She was born and raised in Arkansas, deep south, and eventually ended up in the north decades later. But so that's kind of where I come from. So
I see why you said it was complicated.
yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. So I guess now we can start getting into the religious aspect of it. So I think early on, I was kind of already sort of, I kind of had this reputation of being this like, I was always asking questions about a variety of things. So um, I do remember being interested in science and like school and stuff like that, and learning about like dinosaurs and like space and all that stuff. Actually, I ended up uh, being the first person from my family to go to college, and I got a bachelor's degree in physics. I'm currently in a PhD program for physics. I'm in my third year right now.
As a foster kid.
Yeah. And my sister, she's in medical school right now. She's almost done. And I'm very proud of her. And I do think that without help from the larger community, I don't think I would be where I am today. There have been so many people who've come into my life and were willing to help. And we'll talk about this more, but I do find that interesting because there are some people who will say, oh, well, I find it strange that you don't believe in God, because clearly God has worked in your life. And I've found that so strange, because it's like there are so many people that I grew up with who are not doing well right now. I know people who never got to the age of 30. Some of these people were murdered. Some of these people, there were other things that happened. But for some reason, I'm special and they're not. Not only that, I think good people did assist me and help me. And I think by attributing that to God, like you're taking away the goodness that people do have, you know. But anyway, so it was interesting. So I was always into the science thing ever since I was a little kid. And I think my family and my community actually encouraged that. But there was also like this mix of things that like I would see on TV that were pseudoscience and stuff. I do think I did believe them at the time.
Tell me about what you're talking about now. What did you see that was pseudoscience on TV?
Things like ancient aliens.
I knew you were going to say that.
And
I knew you were going to say that, and that's the reason I asked.
yeah.
Yeah, there was a believer that was bothering me yesterday with all the crazy things that they believe.
Mhm.
And one of the sources they cited was the Ancient Aliens TV show. And I said that I can hardly think of anything less reliable than Ancient Aliens. And that was the problem I had when I was watching what I thought was the History Channel. So this ought to be history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they start talking about reptiloids from the Sirius star system. And that was the last moment that I watched of the History Channel.
Wow.
But thank you for clarifying that.
And there was a big thing. So I grew up in the early 2000s, and this was before 2012. So there's a lot of this talk about doomsday and the end of the world and the Mayan calendar. And so there were a lot of shows on about that stuff, the Bermuda Triangle. And it was all mixed in with like actual like educational shows. Like, oh, here's a show where we're going to talk about World War II. And it was like, you know, historically accurate and everything. And then the next thing is like ancient aliens, and then this. And then, so there wasn't really anyone there to like kind of separate all. So it was all kind of jumbled up together for me.
Yeah. So reptiloids from the Sirius star system who have donned human guise and have taken over the Illuminati. This is what makes me weep for our world at this point. I was going to say our generation, but I'm not that generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know how to explain it. I remember lamenting how people around me all my life have, in the United States, have celebrated their stupidity and praised their ignorance. Ignorance is a superpower somehow. And they're proud of how stupid they are and trying to get more so.
Yeah, that's something that bothers me now at this age. Like, in particular, like one thing I notice is like, it's almost like, I don't think I'm a math genius. I think I do know more math than most of the general population, but that's only because of the field that I'm in, and I studied really hard. I do believe that if people really tried, they could learn more math than they think. But there seems to be like a good example of what you're talking about is like it's almost like it's cool to not be good at math. Like there's always like this joke, like, haha, I don't know, it's trigonometry or something. Oh, we don't know that. And like, almost like people are like, it's like a hee hee ha ha sort of thing,
Yeah.
but it's like cool to be dumb.
Yeah. I remember
And
when
yeah.
I tried to dive into calculus 15 years after my last class in algebra. I struggled, and I was amazed that I just that the tutors and such are explaining to me, of course you don't remember algebra from 15 years ago. If you had taken that last semester, you'd be breezing through this class right now.
Mhm. Yeah. So, like I said, there was a mix of science, pseudoscience, and the religious aspect was more of like, I do remember once asking a family member, I don't remember how old I was. I don't really know how I worded it, but it was more along the lines of like, where do we come from? Why are we here? And I do recall a family member basically trying to explain God to me, and basically said there's somebody who lives in the sky and he created us and blah 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 blah. And I wanted to learn more about that. And I do recall eventually we started going to church. I believe it was a Baptist church. Um, and I'm like 7 or 8 years old. And I just remember seeing people like speaking in tongues and things like that, like next to me. And
Mhm.
it's like, what is this? You know? Like, I didn't really understand it. And I'm trying to learn everything. So they even got me a Bible. And I tried to read the thing from the start. And it's I was a believer, yes, but I didn't understand it. I remember, it's so funny because I remember um one of the memories I have is like I was reading the Bible and then they're saying these names and I was like, and blah 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 begot blah 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 blah. And I'm like, what does this mean? I'm reading a genealogy, but I don't know what that is. And I'm just like, I just keep
And
reading.
what's the relevance? This is the one book that this God wrote for all mankind for all time.
Yeah.
And it's provincial. It only pertains to this one tribe of people in this one place at this one time and not to anybody else. None of the information is accurate about anything. There's nothing helpful in here, nothing at all.
Mhm.
I mean, when I was in the same situation as you, I'm in church and I don't understand, I realize that the preacher doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. Why am I asking questions of somebody who reveals that he doesn't know the answer? He's just pretending. He's literally up on the podium lying. And
Mhm.
when I try to read the Bible, I remember, right into it at the very beginning. Mom, what's a firmament? I don't know.
Yeah, it was strange, but I didn't understand the Bible, but I was convinced. Okay, someone created us, and this explains it. Maybe I'll understand it later. Um, so then I'm like 12 years old. I Then we sort of got involved with what do you call those churches? The what do you Pentecostals? Yeah. So this pastor, this other pastor, it just goes on and on about the day of Pentecost, and there was this overemphasis on speaking in tongues and this idea of being baptized with the Holy Spirit, and this is probably one of only my like really bad experiences with religion where I think it had a negative effect on me at that time. Like I felt really bad about myself because he's constantly telling us to speak in tongues, and it's this gift that the Holy Spirit gives us. And it's like, why am I not getting it? Something must be wrong with me. Like maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I've sinned too much and the Holy Spirit doesn't want to get into me. Like I was sad,
When
because
what
I'm
you're actually dealing with is exactly what these onstage hypnotists that go to different nightclubs and stuff and they do their act, it's
Mhm.
exactly what they're doing. You have to play along, you have to pretend, and then the more you pretend, the more it works.
Yeah.
But that's what it is.
Yeah. And I could never do it. Um, but my deconversion story actually starts in high school. So um, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was the start of it. So um, I was fortunate enough to go to a great high school in my hometown. It's an all boys Catholic college prep school. Sounds terrible, but it was great. I'm still friends to this day with some of the guys that I met there. It's overall a great community. Um, it's an interesting place. It wasn't very diverse. So the school is in the city, right? But then a lot of the boys that were coming were from white suburbs. So some of these suburbs were like far from the city, like 40, 50 minutes out. So people were paying for their kids to go here. I was on a choice voucher. Basically, the local government paid for me to go there. Um, that was a very interesting place because I think also around the time that's where my political views were formed. And looking back on it now, it's really interesting because faculty and staff at this school were very liberal and like left. Most of the student body, conservatives. They, I mean, I don't know how they became conservative, but it's obvious their families were, and so when it came to talking about religion at the school, I felt like the teachers, even the priests, were very honest about things, and this was the beginning of the end. So for 4 years, we had to take theology every single year in high school. And I'll never forget the first class you take your freshman year is this class called Biblical Literature. We spent the entire year reading the Bible. And I'll never forget that first week. And, we read Genesis. And I'm like, okay, I've read this before. I didn't really understand it. And then they're explaining to me. And then I realized I didn't really understand it because basically it's like two creation stories kind of like smushed together. And he's explaining this to us. And I'm like, wait, what? And then we're reading it. I'm like, wait, it is, And then I remember, and then we read it and we talked about it, blah, blah, blah. And then I remember, I'll never forget, the teacher was like, now, did this really happen? No. We see it as a metaphor and blah, 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 blah. And I'll never forget, I went to my teacher after class and I'm like, what do you mean that this didn't happen? Like I was told that this was literal history, that's how I was raised. And he's like, I understand that's how you were raised, but I'm Catholic. This is a Catholic school, blah, 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 blah. And then that's when I realized, like, wait, there's different types of Christians? And then we had this talk after class, and he's
At
explaining
least
all
you
this stuff to me.
accepted Catholics as Christians.
Yeah, which I found out later a lot of people don't, which blows my mind, So by going through that class, I basically learned, one, not everybody's a Christian. There's other religions. There's other religious texts. Christians don't agree on everything. A lot of the Old Testament was kind of seen as like, oh, this didn't really happen, So like Joshua and his conquest of Canaan, it's like, no, this didn't happen. They're like, this didn't happen. This didn't happen. The Exodus, this didn't happen, right? So I'm like, okay. And then we get to the New Testament. And then I'm finally understanding, like, oh, wait, the Gospels these are different. It's the same story, right? But it's like a different account of the story. And
none of them from an eyewitness.
That's what I'm saying. They were so open-minded that they even told us, we don't know who actually wrote these. The Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, like, that's just, we call them that. That's church tradition. We actually don't know who the writers are, but we're pretty sure some of them copied from something that we call the Q source that we currently don't have, and blah, 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 blah. And then I'm like, wait a minute. We don't even know who wrote these, and they weren't eyewitnesses. And you're telling me that these were written decades later. I got to the point where I was like,
And
I
all
still
these
wasn't quite an
prophecies,
atheist yet,
all these
but it was,
prophecies that were supposedly fulfilled,
yeah,
that weren't written in the book until after they happened.
yeah. That blew my mind. I was just not aware of this until that point. And so I still wasn't an atheist yet because I think there was kind of like you could think of it as like a barrier that I had to get over. And it wasn't that like I was afraid to say that there was no God. It was more of like even that idea just I couldn't even entertain it. It's like, well, obviously this had to be created somehow. These people just don't know what they're talking about. No one really knows. And then I went to college. And at that point, I was comfortable calling myself an agnostic. And this is a little bit of a silly story, but there was a girl that I was really interested in college. And she's Palestinian and she's a Muslim. And I do recall asking one of her friends, like telling one of her friends, like, because I don't know the cultural norms and stuff. I'm interested in, so and so. And then the first thing she said was like, "Well, do you want to marry her?" And I'm like, "I'm 19. What are you talking? What are you talking about?" It's like, "Well, if you're gonna have to marry her if that's what you want to be with her, and like, you probably have to convert to Islam and blah 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 blah." And I remember I didn't really know too much about Islam. The only frame of reference I had was learning about Malcolm X in school. It was the Nation of Islam. So I'm kind of just like, okay, so this girl would send me like these videos to watch, and her mom even bought me a Quran.
Wow.
And it took me less than 2 weeks. Okay, you guys don't know what you're talking about either. It was very clear. And
Did
I
you
don't know.
get any of the flat earth references?
They sent me these things where they were trying to say that like they had this knowledge of what like I guess the different stages of like how the fetus develops like in the in the womb and stuff. And I'm watching this and I'm like, I know that I don't really know how that works. But by watching, you guys don't know what you're like. It's clear that they didn't know what they were. They were just making up things. It was like, if this was true, then shouldn't we have already had this knowledge like 1,000 years ago? Like, why do you guys have to wait until scientists discover something and then you go back and then you reinterpret something as, oh, that's what they're talking about. Like with the Big Bang, like I know in the Bible, it's like, oh, God stretched that. See, that's what he's talking about. See, it's expanding, like it
And
was.
if it had meant that, nobody would have understood it that way. But everybody at the time understood how Mithras spread his cloak out over the firmament to make the night.
Mhm,
And there's this kind of analogy that everybody knew at the time. So you stretch out the heavens, you stretch it out like a tent,
mhm,
over the dome, and that's the way it would have been understood. So if God had written it that way, he did it deliberately misleadingly.
mhm. So I decided one more time I was going to read the Bible. And at this point, I already knew I didn't really accept the Old Testament. But then going back to the New Testament, I'm just like, let me get this straight. Okay. Why can't God just forgive us? No, he has to bring his son down to sacrifice himself for us, which I had no say in. I was not alive during that time. And this is supposed to be the most important thing in the history of the world. And we have no eyewitness accounts.
Yep. And it's logically completely unnecessary.
And I'm supposed to believe that there was a virgin birth which it turns out that came later. Like, I think the earliest gospel we have is Mark. And you read that there's nothing about that story of Jesus, being born to a virgin and the three wise men. That's not even, that came later.
And the adulteress, the story of the adulteress,
Mm-hmm.
never happened at all. That was just thrown in long after the alleged fact.
And then I got to the point, yeah, I don't believe in Jesus. Like, especially, and then the resurrection, like, the stories, like, don't make sense when you read it. But even if they did, I'm expected to believe that this guy rose from the dead. And then, disappeared, and I'll be back. And it's been 2,000 years and he hasn't been back.
Whereas you would think, we've been conditioned to have the superhero origin story. That would be the origin of Jesus's superpowers, right? Why does the comic end there? we don't hear anything else.
I'm back. I'll see you guys later. It was just, and this all kind of happened around the same time where, and I don't think necessarily this is a good argument, but it was like, well, these people are always talking about how they've had these spiritual, religious experiences. There's people claiming they've seen ghosts and spirits. There's people claiming they've seen aliens and UFOs. And I'm like, I used to really believe in all that stuff. I've never seen any of that. And it's not even just that. It's the people who claim that they've seen it. The evidence is spotty at best. Like, it's not very good evidence. And I'm like, if these things were real, I don't think it should be that hard to show that they're real. Like, why does it always have to be, no, we saw a UFO, and then it's like this horrible video. You can't really make out there's some light. We can't make out anything on it. Like, it's like, what is this? And I think there was an interesting moment. So I think this was in the summer of 2016 or something like that. And I was able to do research for a summer at another university, and they paid me. And this was a smaller school. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And I remember one of the students in the program was like, oh, there's going to be an ISS flyby tomorrow night. Do you guys want to come see it? And I'm like, how can you see the International Space Station? Like, oh, well, we have these apps on our phones and we can track it and blah, blah, blah. Right. And so we went out that night and it was very foggy. And we have our phones out and we're watching this app. And so we track the ISS. And I kid you not, you hear no noise. And it's like this big glowing ball. And it's like really foggy out. So you can't really make out what it is. But there's like this glowing orb floating and it's moving across the sky kind of fast, making no noise. And the first thing I said to myself, if I didn't know what that was, I would have thought it was a UFO. And that's when I realized I'm actually learning about things now. And people come up with all types of explanations for things that they don't understand. And I realized what atheism actually was. And then once I got comfortable with the idea of like, hey, like, just because there's no thing or whatever that created us that gives us morality or whatever people claim, that doesn't mean you still can't be a good person. Just because there's no afterlife doesn't mean you can't enjoy life now. Just because there's no one mandating that you need to treat everybody with respect and blah, 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 and all that.
Which
just
is
because
not
there's no
what
one
God
doing.
that's not what God ever said anyway.
Yeah. Just because
anywhere in the Bible doesn't say respect other people. Quite the opposite.
Yeah. Just because, like, once I start to actually entertain that idea, and then I heard other people like explain like we you don't need it. My explanation is this: I don't rape people because I don't want to. And I'm like, I don't rape people because I don't want to. You know, and then once I got comfortable with that idea that this was not required, I was comfortable calling myself an atheist. And I think for a lot of people, because there was a time where it's not even that I was afraid to consider it. I couldn't even wrap my head around that concept that there is no like ultimate plan that some deity create. Like, I think some people do have a hard time with that. And so when they hear that someone's an atheist, like they don't get it like at all. Like they can't even like hypothetically think they just can't wrap their head around it like at all.
You mentioned earlier about people who are respected simply because they're believers and then they're never questioned. And my thought first went to Steve Harvey.
I've seen clips of yeah.
Yeah.
I think what he said was rude, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't think he gets it. Like he can't even wrap his head around that idea. Like,
Yeah.
and he's
Because
like, where do you get
never
your morality from?
He's never analyzed his own position. If you're an atheist, then you're stupid. What was it he said? That where's your moral barometer? And I don't know what it would take to explain to somebody like Steve Harvey what morality is and how Christianity does not promote reality, certainly not objective reality like believers keep saying.
Yeah. And then it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to debate people, but I started to question people around me who I knew were like very religious. And some people they've never even, like they believe it, but then you realize some of them have never really even thought about it much, you know? Like I said to one of my friends, close friend, well, why do you believe? Well, I'm not sure. I'm like, well, think about it. You know, well, it's just the way that I was raised. Like you get stuff like that, and it's just like this is someone who hasn't really thought about it, which is fine. So I backed off.
My mother told me this sentence, this actual sentence verbatim. She said, I believe what I believe because that's what I believe. I believe that. And I'm not going to believe what you believe because it's not what I believe. How do you argue with that logic?
Yeah. And then there are just people who are uninformed. So this is interesting. So like I said, I went to a Catholic school and people were surprised to hear that, oh yeah, we learned about evolution and it wasn't like weird or anything. They didn't say it didn't happen. They completely accepted it for what it was. And they just said, oh, well, this is the way God did it. It's evolution. And they taught us evolution. It wasn't, you know, some like Hovind BS, the way that he does it. Like, no, they taught it to us the right way, the correct way. And I know you just start realizing that, like, when you start having these conversations with people, like, at first I was worried that, oh, maybe I'm doing this because maybe it makes me feel better about myself. Oh, because some people are like, oh, you just think you're smarter than people. And I was like, is that really why I'm doing this?
If you did think you were smarter than other people, would you not think that it would be in their best interest for you to help them?
I think that makes sense. Like, but I realized it was a mix of that, but also like once I got out of it and just didn't accept it anymore, asking other people just why do you believe this? What convinced you? Like, what have you experienced that I haven't? Or like and you start realizing that there's people who just don't know anything about it. Like I do have another friend who was very outspoken about his beliefs and how he's a Christian, and this man's 30 years old like me, and he doesn't know, and this is not like I don't think this is like difficult, at least now, but like he doesn't know that the gospels are not eyewitness accounts. In fact, the authors make it clear that it's not, oh, this is how it was told to me, blah, 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 blah. This is what, like, he doesn't know these things. And then I tell him this, and he's like, oh, that's not true. I'm like, it's true. Like, these are not eyewitness accounts. You know, or just, there were just so many things that he just, that at this point I consider maybe not common knowledge, but are just like basic things about the Bible or
Are we
Christianity in
talking
general.
about the people that you're talking about? Are they the same as, say, in my family and inner circle when I was growing up? People who believe the Bible but have never cracked it open and don't care what it says.
They claim they have, and I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Because if you did, you would realize immediately there's a lot of horrible things that happen in there that are mandated by God. God's telling people to do things. Like, and there's one thing that is fascinating. So, like, I remember there's a particular story. So there's the, it's like Abraham where, you know, God tells him to go and kill his son. Right. I remember, and this is what I'm saying. It's because that's the only way I can put it. It's because, like, clearly someone wrote this story with the idea that like they're trying to show like how you're supposed to trust God, but it's not perfect, right? Because at the end of the day, God's telling you to go kill your son. Like, why would you do that? Like, that's immoral. Do you really love me? Well, I want you to go kill your son. Do you really love me? Go and do that. Right. So we read this, I think it's called Fear and Trembling by, I think it's Kierkegaard, some philosopher / theologian from back in the day. And I'll never forget, we read this in class, and like, he's trying to figure out, like, how can we explain this story? He comes up with all these explanations and says, oh, this doesn't work because blah, 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 blah. And then he gets to the end and he's like, we can't understand this story. Why? Because it's a love story. And then he coins this phrase, this like, what is it? It's like, there must be something above the ethical that we can't possibly understand that justifies this story. And I think the phrase is like the theological suspension of the ethical. So to save this story and make it good, you're going to just invoke that there's something above ethics and morality that we can't possibly understand just to save the story. And I'm just like, you're muted. You're muted.
I'm sorry. And this from people who were conditioned that you have to believe the Bible no matter what. From a Catholic tradition originally, where they weren't even allowed to read the Bible.
Yeah.
They just have it explained to them.
And it was in Latin.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the local language. I think it wasn't until like the 60s or something where they started to allow the mass and stuff to be done in like the local languages, I think we were taught. So yeah, so if you lived in like, I don't know, Latin America, for example, and you speak Spanish or something, or Portuguese, right? Then like in the 1800s, like your mass was like in Latin.
Yep.
A dead language that nobody speaks.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. I tried so hard because it was like, maybe there's something I'm missing about this. So I would go out of my way to listen to the people like that people would consider, I guess you could call them apologists or theologians, like philosophers, those types of people. And
I would venture to guess that there is somebody listening to you right now, recounting the story, and they are still in the mindset that they've been conditioned that they have to believe the Bible. It doesn't matter that they don't understand it. It doesn't matter that it doesn't make sense. They have to believe it no matter what. And they are very angry at you because you don't blindly believe it. And they're trying to figure out a way to explain to you in the comments right now how you're supposed to believe it, only they don't themselves know. They don't understand it themselves, can't explain it to you either.
Yeah, it's just, this is what I'll say for people who like, I'm not really someone who's going to go out of my way to try to deconvert people because, well, first of all, I do think people are entitled to their beliefs, whatever. But I don't know how people like you are do what you do because, granted, I do understand that. Like I've seen people say that you've helped them, like your content and these, but it seems so exhausting. I don't have the patience that you have. Um, I think what you do is important because one of my big concerns right now is, now I'm not saying that you can't be in the government because you're religious. But what I am saying is I don't want people making decisions in the government based on their religious beliefs.
I hear that.
And I think, again, you're older than me, so I don't know. Again, I don't know what it was like 50 years ago. But I do think
The arguments haven't changed. Well, with one exception. When I was a little kid, people used to say nobody's ever seen the evolution of a new species. Well, now we have so many times that they don't say that anymore. But now they've just moved the goalpost for what macroevolution is. They moved it to the genus level and then to the family level, and then Ken Ham tried to move it to the some clade above family to like not phylum, but you know where I'm class maybe wherever it needs be. Order, that's what it was. He moved it to order, except not applicable to humans in any case.
they have a new tool, the internet. I think they, again, I don't know what it was like back in the day, but like it's so easy now for people to go online. All you need is someone who's charismatic, maybe physically appealing to people, and make a short clip that's like 10 seconds, say whatever they want, and people just believe it, whether it's religious things, uh, the conspiracy stuff, especially, which I thought was pretty sad because there were people that I knew who came out of the COVID pandemic conspiracy nuts because all they did, they had nothing to do. So they're at home on the internet all day. And I'll never forget, there was a friend of mine who I remember he started posting all this like strange stuff online. And I'm like, I didn't really question him on like his beliefs. It was more of like, where did you learn about all this? And he's like, oh, I'll show you. And then he sent me a link. And there's just some YouTube channel going on and on about like how Trump is the chosen one and all this like religious imagery and all this stuff. And I'm just like,
dramatic music playing in the background.
It was obviously just bullshit. Like it wasn't even like, oh, you need to vote for Trump. It was all like this conspiracy stuff and oh, they're out to get him and he's going to expose, the child sex trafficking rings. That's why they're like, it was crazy. And it was sad because I'm like, let me get this straight. You did 4 years at a university and you have no critical thinking skills. They just say something in the video and you accept it. You don't even go and look into it further. Like, oh, what's this story? What were they talking about?
Tell the people what they want to believe, and they will pay you to lie to them.
It's bad. Like, and I did mention to you, like, you see, once I became an atheist, I did start looking more like, because I was already kind of involved online, like in certain circles, so like the video game community and stuff, which on social media, those people are losing their minds, which I'll explain in a second. But it's all kind of related. Um, I remember around like 2015, 2016, uh, there were, I'm not going to name people. You probably have seen it. I don't know. There were some atheist YouTubers who kind of went down the deep end, and um, and I think some of their followers followed them, and it was like, people went from like making atheist content to like making fun of feminists, and all of these sort of things. Um, and that was a difficult time for me, because in undergrad uh, I was falsely accused of a crime of a sexual nature that didn't happen. Um, and I'll just say the conservatives almost got me, because at that time, I'm looking for support, uh, and I couldn't really find any. And at first, it was like the people who would bring this up, that sometimes people do lie about this, at the time were conservatives, from what I saw. But then, the more you start listening to them, it goes from, oh, you were wronged, and that's not right that they did that to you, right? Which is fair, I think. But then it gets to the point where, oh, you know what the problem is? It's the feminists. Oh, it's not just the feminists. It's all these people, and then they try to get you in. And I think for some people, it's been very successful. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting old, but I am worried. Because
Gosh, in our current political climate, what is there to be worried about?
Because people it just seems like people lack critical thinking skills. They hear something online,
Mm-hmm.
and just accept it. And I think there are some people who are just,
And it
for
doesn't
whatever,
matter
yeah,
how insane it is. It used to matter when your political leaders or representatives were insane and said crazy things. But now, when Marjorie Taylor Greene says that Democrats control the weather, nobody bats an eye. That's perfectly all right. When Lauren Boebert says that voters have too many rights, and that we therefore should let the politicians choose our next candidates instead of we the people, and everybody bows to that too. That's all of that is disturbing.
yeah. I don't think people realize. So I'm definitely someone who's pro-choice. Um, for me, one of the big things was when the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. Like, I never thought that would ever happen.
Yeah.
If they can do that, they can overturn anything.
Yep. Yeah.
And I don't think
I was
people
shocked by that too.
that. The fact that was overturned, that's crazy.
And the fact that I was mystified at the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert were both re-elected despite being the stupidest embarrassments to the Republican Party that I could think of, except for Trump himself. So I should not have been surprised at all that they re-elected him.
I think social media has done wonders for conservatives. I feel like even on YouTube, like I think YouTube kind of, like I try to avoid that content, but you get recommended this sort of content like all the time because it's the stuff that gets the views, it's the stuff that gets the comments and all that. So like it's
My lament is all of this came, as I said, when I was a child, and everyone around me seemed to celebrate their stupidity. It was, pride was seen as a bad thing, although everybody is excessively arrogant and narcissistic now, so they haven't paid much attention to that. But the way to be good about pride was to have self-deprecating humor, which meant you would brag about how stupid you are. And so we had a grassroots thing about, they may got book learning, but they ain't got no common sense. That's what I heard growing up as a kid.
mm-hmm.
So that's where we're at. People with no common sense. Who are proud
really
to be
sad.
dumb.
And I get it, no one's perfect. But when you start realizing like there's people around you that you know who are bigots, like I think like over the last 2 years,
and we're not just talking about your uncle at Thanksgiving either. We're talking about people you grew up with, went to school with, loved most of your life.
I am I'm okay. So I'll put it like this: I was fortunate enough, I think, to be raised in an environment where, so I'm straight, but like where if you were like gay or something like that, like it was never frowned upon in my home. Like I like it's fascinating. So like I remember some people might think this is bad, but whatever. Like it I remember so my mom would always watch uh like the Maury show, right? And I remember there would be these episodes where um now they weren't using the word like trans women, but that's basically what they were, where they would bring these trans women who were basically models, and they'd go down the runway and they'd be in these outfits and stuff, and it was like, is it a man or a woman? That was sort of the game. And I remember sitting down watching this kind of stuff with my family, and my family was engaged in it, but like they never said anything bad about these people. It was never like, don't be like them. This is disgusting. Like they never said anything bad, ever. Even today, like my family doesn't care. My family doesn't care if you're gay or trans.
I wish I could say the same. I'm straight too, but I was trained to be homophobic as a kid, and it took meeting the college experience of meeting people. You're trained to hate Muslims until you meet some. You're trained to hate black people till you meet some. Obviously, your case is different. You're trained to hate all these other people. This is the way I was raised. Trained to hate all these people until you meet them, and then you're like, well, what is the big deal? Now, the racism thing never stuck with me, probably because my dad used the N-word so aggressively, so often, it made me sick. But the homophobic thing did kind of set a little bit. Mm-hmm. Until, as I said, college age, you meet these people and you're like, what the hell? What was the big deal? Yeah. Why was I supposed to be physically violent against these people? Just have to reevaluate and realize that my family didn't know anything. What they told me about what other people believe, whether they were Catholics or atheists or Muslims or whoever, turns out my family was always wrong every time. Mm-hmm. So I stopped listening to what they said.
Yeah, and like I said, the last couple of years, it made me realize how bad it kind of is. Not kind of, how bad it actually is for LGBTQ people. Because like I said, there were people that I knew who I was shocked to find out, oh, I voted for Trump. Why? He's going to get LGBTQ out of the schools. And I'm like, what? What? And they're like so against, like, oh, some people do use a religious, excuse for this, and I'm like, there's a story in the Bible. So Sodom and Gomorrah. I think you probably know this,
Yeah.
right? So it's like when the angels show up, and like they go to, I think it's Lot, right? His house,
Yep.
and these local men are like, oh, these men are so they're so beautiful, we want to have sex with them. They weren't trying to rape him, I don't think. But people use that as like, oh, that means that God's anti-gay, like gay is bad, because Lot wouldn't let these men have sex with the angels. But then he turns around and says, but I have daughters, you can take them.
Yeah. There's just
Like
everything
God,
wrong with
like
that story.
so is that condoning? Like it's just, oh
Yeah.
my God. I
All right. I don't know. You told me to call you Afrophysicist or Afro or whatever, and I don't have a means of addressing you that is short or comfortable.
Mhm.
But I do have another gig coming up. We've been at it for an hour, so I'm going to ask you to close up.
All right. Well, thank you for meeting with me, Oren. I just hope that I appreciate what you do, and I hope you continue to do it, because I can't do it. I just don't have the patience for it. It's yeah. So thank
Yeah,
you.
I get that. And thank you very much for that. All right. Where can anybody find you if you want them to find you?
I don't want anyone to find me. So that's all. But I do hope that someone hears this and just, my point is, it wasn't really to try to deconvert anyone, but hopefully there's someone out there similar to me. Just want, if you do hear it, like, you're not alone, and there's a lot of people out here just like you. And, yeah, they might not live in your city or state or whatever, but we're around. There are Black atheists. So
Thank you much.
yeah. All right. Thank you, Arn. You have a great day.